let me bring you up to date a little bit on where we are and where we're going. This week we'll be dealing with Chapter 8, but this is like Chapter 7. This is a very big chapter and there's a lot of information in it. So I'm going to take 2 weeks for Chapter 8. And there'll be a separate quiz on each week. This week we'll do sort of the first half of the chapter, which runs up to the point that, and each book will be different, so I'm not sure which edition you have, but there's some place in there, middle of the chapter, it says the Jefferson presidency or the election of Jefferson or something. That'll be the breaking point from the information from this half and the information that will be the second half, which we'll cover next week. And I just want to get a note in here that as I've been doing this, I really miss interacting with you. I enjoy very much asking you questions, getting your responses, listening to your questions in class, having you participate. That means a lot to me, and I've missed it a lot. I'm not sure how to deal with that, and there are probably ways to deal with it through Canvas, but I don't know what those are. But let me just encourage you, if you have any questions, any problems, send me an email to my regular email address, EnergyAuth. Make advantage, some of you have taken advantage of it with some problems, but I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have you ask a question and say, go over this or explain this again, or what's wrong with you, whatever is on your mind. Send me an email. I'd love to get it, and I will be checking it, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So I just invite you to take advantage of the email as an alternative to actual class participation. All right, so last week we were talking about the Constitution, and I didn't quite finish. I wanted to get through the point where we got the Constitution ratified. You understand the process is that in each state a special convention was held. The people were invited to elect delegates to a separate convention solely for the purpose of ratifying the Constitution. And I mentioned last week that some states the process was very quick and easy. Several states ratified it, and the conventions ratified the Constitution unanimously. Several states had completed the process by December of 1787. The work just started in the fall, and within a couple of weeks some states had completed that process. And then in other states there's opposition to the Constitution. And as time went on, the various states, one after another, ratified, but each one was getting a little bit harder because in each one there was more and more opposition. By the summer of 1788, the process had almost stopped. No more states looked like they were going to ratify it. In the remaining states, there was varying amounts of opposition, but a lot of opposition to the Constitution. The opposition is from people we call the anti-federalists, opposed to the Federalists. And by, say, June of 1788, there were 7 states had ratified, 6 had not. We only needed 2, and it could have been any 2 of those. But the key ones, as I told you last week, were Virginia, because it was the largest state, and New York, because it contained one of our major cities, one of our major ports. It was a very important economic state. And there was a real deadlock as Federalists and Anti-Federalists argued and couldn't reach an agreement. Out of that in both states came something fairly important. In New York, what happened was that Alexander Hamilton decided we needed to do something to try to get this Constitution ratified. Hamilton in many ways was one of the key people in the Constitution. It was he who at the failed Annapolis Convention sort of salvaged things, suggested let's have another convention. It was sort of his idea to have the Constitutional Convention. So in many ways he was the father of the Constitution. He's an important person. Now he was not happy with the Constitution because he would have liked a Constitution that did away with states altogether. on this issue of whether we're going to be a single nation or a federation of states, something that I stressed was very important to understand what's going on. He was a hardliner and an extreme advocate of single nation. And he went to the point that we should not even have states, forget about states. The Virginia plan still called for states, but Hamilton would have gotten rid of them altogether. And there was absolutely no support in the convention for that idea. The delegates there were just not willing to give up their states, their state legislatures, so Hamilton's idea was totally rejected. And at times he had a hard time dealing with the fact that here it's his idea and nobody likes his ideas. So he's pretty unhappy. And there was a time when he went home and he pouted and then he decided to come back. And he's decided that although the Constitution is not what he would like, it's not as far going in the direction of a single nation as he wanted, he was very disappointed with it, but he said, you know, it's got to be ratified. It's better than the Articles. We can't keep living under the Articles of Confederation, which are a disaster because the states are actually the parties of the whole Articles. So he's devoted himself to ratifying the Constitution. So he consulted James Madison, who was another person very, very important in the Constitution. The actual Virginia plan, which served as the basis for the Constitution, was largely written by Madison and then endorsed by the other members of the Virginia delegation. The final result made many changes to the Virginia plan, specifically in the structure of the Senate, or of Congress, of adding the Senate in accordance with the New Jersey plan. Madison also was not happy about that. He felt that Virginia should have stuck to its guns and insisted that we had to adopt the Virginia plan and not allow the New Jersey plan to come in. He did not like the idea that you could have this idea that some delegates some of the members of the Senate would be coming from very large states, some from small states, but they'd all have the same vote. That made him unhappy. He didn't think that was fair. He didn't think that was right. He didn't think that was in accordance with Republican principles. So he was not happy, but he's also decided we've got to get it ratified. So Hamilton invited Madison to join him in New York, and then he invited another member of the New York delegation who had been just one of the delegates and not particularly famous at the delegation, but a man named John Jay. And the three of them got together under Hamilton's guidance and drew up some papers that would be published in a Federalist-leaning newspaper by agreement with Hamilton. He'd worked out a deal with the publisher of a newspaper in town to publish the papers that these three guys are going to write. And the idea is to create enough public sentiment in favor of the Constitution that the convention would finally give in to public will and vote to ratify. That was the theory. So they started writing, and they wrote articles about the description of the Constitution, how it was going to work, and why it was necessary for the country. As it happened, their effort was unnecessary. By the time any of the articles actually got started published, the convention had finally broken the deadlock and had finally gone ahead and voted to ratify. So they didn't really need to publish them. But they went ahead with it anyway, and those articles, those papers, became very, very important to this day as analyses of the Constitution, analyses of what it meant, what it was about, what it was supposed to do. Those are called the Federalist Papers, the Federalist Papers. We don't know who wrote all of them individually. We think that Hamilton probably wrote most of them. Madison wrote a few. He wrote some of the important ones and then kind of went back to Virginia, so he was not involved in the later ones. We don't think Jay did too much. Some we're not sure of the authors. Some may have been done jointly. We don't know. But there's 87 papers called the Federalist Papers. And if you ever go on to a four-year school and take a class in constitutional politics, I think take a poli-sci class in the Constitution, or if you go to law school and take a class in constitutional law, which you will do, that's a standard part of the law school curriculum, it's sort of like the textbook, the starting book, is the Federalist Papers. And we've had some real arguments in recent months over the meaning of the Constitution. During the time of the impeachment of President Trump, many people referred to the Federalist Papers as evidence of what the Founding Fathers were thinking when they wrote the Constitution. So it remains an important document to this day, even though in the immediate short run, it had no impact. It was designed to do something that was already done by the time the papers got published. But as an important event in American history, the Federalist Papers stands out for its analysis of the Constitution. So, but New York did ratify with or without the articles, without the Federalist Papers. In Virginia, there's a deadlock, and the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are going back and forth and getting nowhere, and nobody wants to change. And I told you, one of the issues that's many Anti-Federalists raised, and this was one of the main things that the Anti-Federalists in Virginia insisted on, and they made a big argument about it, and they used that as one of the reasons why we should not ratify the Constitution. And the issue was that the Constitution did not include a Bill of Rights. So many of the Anti-Federalists said, you know, we can't ratify it. It doesn't have a Bill of Rights. So after this stalemate goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks, the Federalist delegates made an offer to the Anti-Federalists at the convention, and they said, look, if we agree to add a Bill of Rights as amendments to the Constitution after it's ratified, will you vote for ratification? And after some discussion, they basically cut a deal there in Virginia during the ratifying convention. And the deal was that enough of the Anti-Federalists would change their mind and vote for ratification, and then once it was ratified, the people who were there who were supporting the Federalist cause, the pro-Constitution members of the convention, would work to add a Bill of Rights as amendments to the Constitution. So that got it done. So Virginia also ratified. The vote, I happen to remember the numbers, vote was still close. It was 79 to 69. There was still a substantial number of delegates in Virginia who still did not like the Constitution, still would not accept it. So there was still opposition to the Constitution. Remember that the next time somebody talks about what the Founding Fathers wanted. But remember, there were a lot of Founding Fathers who didn't even want the Constitution. And in Virginia, it was close, but they got a majority, and that's all that mattered. It was a majority of the delegates finally voted to confirm. So now we had 9 states, so we could proceed. Eventually, I don't remember what states 10 and 11 were. They ratified within a couple more months once the momentum was going, and so there 2 more states ratified. By fall of 1788, we had 11 states. I remember the last 2. North Carolina did not ratify until about a year later. They still were not ready to accept it. And our longtime opponent of the whole thing, Rhode Island, they stayed out for another couple of years. And then Rhode Island didn't ratify until 2 or 3 years later. There were still substantial opposition to the Constitution in Rhode Island. It was a very strong anti-federalist state. But it didn't matter because we had 11 states, and the only 2 that were not in were 2 of the smaller ones, North Carolina and Rhode Island, so we went ahead without them, and we set up our new government. Now I'm going to refer to this, I'm going to kind of jump ahead here a little bit and call this the Federalist Administration. We're going to be talking about the Federalist Party as being the majority party in the new government. Now that's a little premature. We didn't have any parties yet. There were no parties. But just for sake of reference, I'm going to speak about what eventually became a Federalist Party. So I'm going to use that term, and I'll explain to you when the time comes how we got that party, how we got a party system in this country. We started out, though, without any parties. And that was sort of what Americans wanted. They wanted a system where there would be no political partisanship in Congress or in the country. They had seen political partisanship with England and Parliament. Parliament was an extremely contentious body. There were different factions within Parliament. They all hated each other. There's little groups here and little groups there, and they're all scheming to take over control of the country. The king is working with some of the factions and trying to promote things that he wants, and there's just an immense politics. To study English history at that time is extremely complicated, and I stay away from it because it takes forever to explain all of the different political factions within Parliament. And Americans had seen that, and they thought, this is one of the reasons why we want to get out of any kind of relationship with Parliament. Those guys are a bunch of corrupt politicians. So we started with an idea that we wouldn't have partisan politics. And it worked at the beginning. In that first election of 1788, we finally got together and had an election of the president. And as you probably know, George Washington was elected by the Electoral College unanimously. There was no divisiveness. And so Congress started meeting then in December of 1788. It took a little while for the president to be officially nominated, just to get the paperwork done and go through the legal formalities. Theoretically, he was supposed to be inaugurated on March 4th, 1789. They just couldn't get it. It was just too hard to get all the stuff done. The states had to meet, they had to choose their electors, the electors had to meet, da-da-da-da-da. And so it was not until mid-April that Washington was finally confirmed and inaugurated. But we've got the country going. The country has got up and we've got a government, and I'm going to call it the Federalist government, just to have a term to use. I'll send you by the list that I usually provide for you, the names of the people, but let me just tell you to them here. As I said, Washington was elected as president. The vice president in this new government was John Adams. Just a note on John Adams. He had been out of the country for several years. He had been our ambassador to England, and so he was in England. So during all the time that we're writing the Constitution and debating its ratification and so forth, Adams was not a participant. He was off in England, serving his country there, but not involved in any of the debates over the Constitution or the writing of it or anything. He had nothing to do with it. So he was elected as vice president. Then Washington appointed his cabinet, and then as now, the most important officer in the cabinet is Secretary of State. That's always been the key position in the cabinet. And for that position, Washington appointed Thomas Jefferson. So these are familiar names. A little note about Jefferson, he too had been gone. He was not in the United States during all of the years of the articles and the debate over ratification and the writing of the Constitution. He was serving as our ambassador to France. So he was in France while all of that debate and so forth is going on. But now he returns and becomes the Secretary of State. Another important position was Secretary of Treasury. We're going to have to deal with the economic problems. For that, Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton. And then just one last person of a name that's familiar. As Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, he appointed John Jay. So that's sort of the lineup of the officials of our first government administration.